The world between worlds is not empty. Those who have walked long enough in shadow know this. Know that the darkness between stars is not absence, but presence. That the void has texture and weight, and, sometimes, intention. Aragorn, son of Arathorn, had walked in shadow for 88 years. He recognized the feeling of being watched by something vast. The rift had opened without warning. They had been riding south through the Grey Havens Road, 13 rangers returning from a patrol along the Trollshaws, when the air ahead of them simply split. There was no thunder, no great magical pronouncement, only a seam of pale silver light that widened, like a wound in the fabric of the evening sky. And then the cold, a cold so absolute it silenced even the horses, and then nothing. And then snow, and a forest that was wrong. The trees were too dark, their bark almost black, their branches tangled in patterns that no tree of Eriador ever grew. The snow was deeper than it should have been for the season, and the wind carried something in it that Aragorn felt not with his body but with some older part of himself, the part that had stood in the presence of the Nazgul and refused to run. This wind carried death, not the metaphor of death, death itself, moving through the air like a living thing, tasting everything it touched. He raised his fist. The rangers stopped instantly, soundless. For a long moment, there was only the wind. Then Halbarad brought his horse alongside Aragorn's and said, very quietly, "This is not the Trollshaws." "No," Aragorn agreed. "Where are we?" Aragorn looked at the sky. The stars were wrong. Not dramatically, not the stars of some alien heaven, but subtly displaced, as though the world had been picked up and set down a few degrees from where it belonged. He had studied the stars since childhood under Elrond's patient tutelage, and these stars were close to home, but not home. A copy made by someone who had only heard home described. "I don't know," he said, "but something is coming from the north." He could feel it before he heard it. The same instinct that had kept him alive through decades of orc hunts and ringwraith encounters. A pressure at the base of the skull, a narrowing of the world. Then the sound reached them, crashing through underbrush, ragged breath. Feet that had forgotten the luxury of pace and remembered only the animal necessity of faster. The wildlings came through the treeline in a broken knot of 8. Men and women both, fur-wrapped, faces hollowed by terror. They pulled up short at the sight of 13 mounted strangers, and for one suspended moment the tableau held. Refugees staring at rangers. Rangers staring at refugees. The wind moving between them carrying its freight of cold death. One of the wildlings, a broad woman with a broken nose and a spear. She was still sensible enough to be holding, found her voice first. "Who in 7 hells are you?" "Travelers," Aragorn said, in the common tongue, and was quietly relieved when she understood him. "From far away. What are you running from?" She stared at him. Behind her, one of the men was weeping silently, the tears freezing on his cheeks before they reached his jaw. "The dead," she said. "The dead are walking. The dead are everywhere." She said it the way people say things they have watched others disbelieve, the way people say things they have stopped expecting to be understood. She said it as a statement of private, absolute fact. "The army of the dead. They're 3 hours behind us, and there is nothing, no fire, no blade, nothing that stops them." Aragorn felt Halbarad look at him. He did not look back. He was watching the woman's eyes, the specific quality of her fear, the way it sat in her face not as panic but as certainty. He had seen that look before. He had seen it on the faces of men who had stood on the Pelennor and watched the Nazgul descend. He had seen it on his own face, once, in a still pool in Rivendell, when he was young enough to still be surprised by what the world contained. He recognized it. This was the fear of people who had looked at the enemy and understood, finally and completely, that it wanted everything. 3 hours, he said, and there is a fortress. Winterfell. The woman's chin came up with something that might, under other circumstances, have been pride. South. An hour's ride. Maybe less if you know the path. The king in the north is there. Daenerys Stormborn. They're making their stand. Aragorn turned to his rangers. 12 faces looked back at him, weathered, scarred, calm in the manner of men who have made peace with difficult odds so many times that peace with difficult odds has become simply their natural state. He had ridden with these men for decades. He knew their names and their fathers' names, and, in several cases, the names of their fathers' fathers. He knew which of them snored and which of them could start a fire in a rainstorm, and which of them would, without drama or complaint, walk into a cave full of orcs if he asked them to. He looked at the dark trees. He looked at the wrong stars. He thought about the cold in the wind and what it meant and what it intended. There was, he supposed, a version of this moment where he hesitated. If you want to see more characters cross into worlds they were never meant to find, hit that subscribe button and drop a name in the comments below. May the Force, may whatever power guides strange roads, be with you. He touched his heel to his horse's flank. Ride, he said. Show us the way. Winterfell at the edge of the long night was not a place that welcomed strangers. The gates were shut and manned by men with the specific posture of soldiers who had stopped sleeping, upright but hollow, watchful in the mechanical way of people who have trained their fear into procedure because procedure is the only thing left. Torches burned along the battlements, in numbers that suggested whoever had ordered them understood. Fire as more than illumination. The smoke rose straight up into the dead still air. The cold pressed down from the north like a hand. Aragorn rode at the front with the wildling woman. Her name, offered grudgingly during the ride, was Lydra, just behind his left shoulder. He had insisted on approaching openly, at a walk, hands visible, which had prompted a brief and pointed exchange with Halbarad, who felt that visible hands were a fine courtesy to offer people who were not currently pointing crossbows at them. The crossbows came out when they were 50 yards from the gate. Hold, Aragorn said quietly, and the rangers held. He looked up at the battlements. A young man was leaning over the parapet, dark-haired, gray-eyed, wearing the kind of expression that accumulates on a person who has been handed impossible responsibilities before they've finished growing into their own face. He was looking at Aragorn with the careful, measuring attention of someone who had learned to read threats quickly. Aragorn recognized the look. He had worn it himself, once. I am Aragorn, son of Arathorn. He called up, his voice carrying the particular quality of a man accustomed to being heard over the noise of battle. A ranger. I come from a land far from here by a road I could not have chosen. These men with me are my kindred, the Dúnedain, hunters of darkness. We have ridden from the north with survivors who carry word of the army behind them. He paused. We have fought the darkness before. We would fight it again, if you will have us. The silence that followed was the silence of a man weighing things quickly. How many? The young man called down. 13, including myself. Another pause. Then, open the gate. His name was Jon Snow, and he had died once, which Aragorn learned within the first 10 minutes, and filed away in the part of his mind that catalogued things which were impossible and yet evidently true. He had the handshake of a swordsman, and the eyes of someone who had looked past the horizon of the known world and come back changed. Aragorn liked him immediately, and with the uncomplicated instinct of a man who has spent his life learning to read people in a hurry. The Great Hall of Winterfell was organized chaos given architectural form. Maps covered every table. Officers moved between them with the harried purposefulness of people who have too many problems and too little time. And the arguments that flared and died at various corners of the room had the sharp, exhausted quality of disputes that had already been had 3 times and resolved nothing. The smell was tallow candles and cold stone and the particular human scent of people who had stopped having time to be clean. Daenerys Targaryen stood at the largest map table and turned when they entered. She was smaller than Aragorn had expected from Lydras. Description: silver-haired, composed in the manner of someone who has learned composure as a survival skill, with violet eyes that moved over Aragorn and his rangers with swift, unsentimental assessment. Beside her stood an older man with a clever, kind face, Ser Davos Seaworth, John murmured, and a tall woman with a scarred face and the most watchful eyes in the room, Brienne of Tarth. Aragorn noted her without staring. A knight, clearly. A serious one. Sansa Stark was there too, at the edge of the table, and she looked at the rangers. The way a person looks at a thing they want very badly to hope in and have learned. Through painful education, not to. John made introductions, with the efficiency of a man who did not have time for ceremony. Aragorn accepted it and offered what he could in return, not the full history, which would have taken hours and strained credulity, but the relevant facts. Rangers, hunters, accustomed to fighting creatures of darkness, arrived by means he did not fully understand and could not fully explain. "You're from another world," Davos said. He said it the way a practical man says something impractical, carefully, without committing to disbelief. "I believe so," Aragorn said. "And you fight the dead in your world. We fight the servants of a great darkness, creatures of shadow and corruption, the dead, animated by malice." He met Davos's eyes. "I know what it is to face something that wants to unmake the living world. I know what it costs. And I know that 13 more swords are not nothing, even against an army." Davos looked at him for a long moment. "No," he said finally. 13 more swords are not nothing." Sansa's assessment was more pointed. She drew Aragorn aside after the initial meeting, with the quiet authority of someone who had learned that survival requires asking the questions others find impolite. "You say you fight darkness in your world," she said. "How often do you win?" Aragorn considered her. "Not always," he said. "I have lost companions. I have lost battles. I have stood at the edge of defeat and found that what I thought was the edge was only another slope." He paused. "But the darkness has not won. Not yet." "That's not as reassuring as you might think," Sansa said. "No," Aragorn agreed. "It isn't. But it's the truth, and I find truth more useful than reassurance." Something shifted in her expression, not warmth exactly, but a recalibration. She looked at him for another moment, then nodded once and walked back toward the map table. He watched her go and thought that she would have made a formidable Dúnedain had the world dealt her different cards. Halbarad appeared at his elbow. "They're afraid," he said quietly. "They should be," Aragorn said. "So should we. Are we?" Aragorn looked north, through the stone walls of Winterfell, toward the cold that was moving toward them with the patience of something that did not need to hurry because it had already won every previous iteration of this moment. "Yes," he said, "but we are here nonetheless." The war room argument began, as most arguments do, not with the largest disagreement, but with a small one that happened to be sitting on top of it. The plan, as Aragorn understood it after an hour of listening, was this. The Dothraki would charge first into the darkness beyond Winterfell's walls, followed by the Unsullied forming defensive lines at the gate, with the bulk of the infantry holding the courtyards while the dragons engaged the Night King's forces from above. The crypts would shelter the non-combatants. Bran Stark, a young man with ancient eyes who sat in a wheeled chair and had said nothing since Aragorn entered the room, only watched him with the unsettling attention of someone reading a book they had already finished, would wait in the Godswood as bait, protected by Theon Greyjoy and a small company of Ironborn. Aragorn listened to all of it without interruption. He had learned long ago that the fastest way to be dismissed in a war council was to speak before you had earned the right to be heard, and he had not yet earned that right in this room. So he listened, and he looked at the map, and he thought about the Pelennor Fields and Helm's Deep and the long night at Amon Hen. And by the time the plan had been fully laid out, he had identified 4 problems serious enough to say aloud, and several more he would keep to himself until the moment they became relevant. He raised his hand. Jon Snow nodded at him. "The Dothraki charge," Aragorn said, "in the dark, against an enemy that cannot be broken by fear and does not tire, and does not slow when it takes losses." He said it without accusation, simply as a statement of the situation's geometry. A cavalry charge is a weapon of terror and momentum. It works because horses are terrifying and momentum is devastating. Against the dead, you lose both advantages within the first 100 yards. The Dothraki commander, a broad, weathered man named Kono, stiffened. Across the table, Ura Mormont's expression suggested he had been thinking something similar and had chosen not to say it. The Dothraki are the greatest riders in the world, Daenerys said. Her voice was even. She was not defensive. She was testing him, Aragorn realized, probing the quality of his thinking. I don't doubt it, Aragorn said. I have seen great cavalry. In my world break armies that lesser soldiers could not have touched. But cavalry requires an enemy that responds to impact and fear. The dead respond to neither. He looked at the map. Send them in as light riders on the flanks, harrying, drawing off, keeping the dead from massing on the walls. Use their speed, not their weight. Silence. What else? Jon said. The crypts. Another silence, of a different quality. The crypts are the safest place in Winterfell, Sansa said, from her position at the table's edge. The crypts are full of the Stark dead, Aragorn said. He kept his voice neutral, factual, the voice he used when delivering news that could not be softened. If your enemy commands the dead, all the dead, indiscriminately, regardless of when or where they died, then the safest place in Winterfell is also the most dangerous. He looked at Jon. I do not know the full nature of your enemy's power. You know it better than I. But if there is any possibility that the dead in those crypts can be raised, then everyone sheltering there is in a room that will become a tomb. The silence this time had weight and texture. Jon and Daenerys exchanged a look that contained an entire conversation. We don't have anywhere else to put them, Davos said quietly. There's nowhere else. Then post armed guards at every crypt entrance, Aragorn said. People who know what to do if the stone begins to move. It may not happen, but if it does, they will need warning and they will need blades. Davos nodded slowly, the nod of a man who recognized sound counsel even when it arrived from an inconvenient direction. It was Ser Jaime Lannister, golden-haired, one-handed, with the bearing of a man who had been the best swordsman in the world and was still renegotiating his identity. In the aftermath, who pushed back most directly. You've been here 6 hours, he said. You don't know this castle. You don't know this enemy. And you're redesigning a battle plan that's taken weeks to develop. I know the enemy, Aragorn said, and something in his voice shifted, not louder, not harder, but older, carrying the weight of 88 years of darkness, fought in cold and mud and shadow. Not your enemy, precisely, but the same species of thing. I know how it thinks. I know what it wants. It wants you to make the mistake that fear makes natural, to gather, to fortify, to trust your walls. He looked at the map. Your walls will fall. They are meant to fall. Your enemy is not trying to breach Winterfell. It is trying to herd everything living into one place so that when the living die, they rise in one place, and your fortress becomes its fortress, and your army becomes its army. The room was very quiet. Bran Stark spoke for the first time. His voice was flat and unhurried, the voice of someone reporting from a great distance. He's right, he said. He was looking at Aragorn with those ancient eyes. He has seen this before. Not the same, but the same. Aragorn looked at the boy. The boy looked back at him with the particular quality of attention that Aragorn associated with Galadriel and Elrond, the attention of someone who perceived more layers of a thing than its surface presented. What are you? Aragorn asked quietly, not rudely, with genuine curiosity. I'm the three-eyed raven, Bran said. And you are the ranger, the one who walks between death and life and has not yet chosen which side of the door to stand on. Several people in the room looked uncomfortable. Aragorn held Bran's gaze a moment longer, then returned to the map. The plan can work, he said, to the room at large, to Jon specifically, with adjustments. But it requires accepting that the walls will not hold and planning for what happens after they fall, not only for what happens if they hold. He set his finger on the godswood. Everything depends on this, on what happens here. Everyone in this room needs to understand that and plan accordingly. Jon Snow studied the map, studied Aragorn. In the torchlight, his gray eyes were the color of the wrong stars. Show me, Jon said. The dead came at midnight. There was no gradual approach. No slow materializing from the tree lean. That might have offered the defenders a last few minutes of psychological preparation. One moment the darkness beyond Winterfell's walls was simply darkness. The next moment it was moving, and the scale of the movement, the sheer lateral extent of it, the way it stretched, from the eastern tree lean to the western ridge without apparent end, produced a sound from the battlements that Aragorn had heard before and never wanted to hear again. It was not a scream and not a moan, but something between them. The sound a large number of people make simultaneously. When the mind refuses the evidence of the eyes, Aragorn was already mounted. He had positioned the Dúnedain outside the main gate during the final hour of waiting, a decision that had required a brief, pointed argument with Tormund Giantsbane, who felt that anyone choosing to be outside the walls when the dead arrived had either extraordinary courage or catastrophically poor judgment, and was not certain which applied here. Aragorn had explained his reasoning with the patience of a man who has learned that the best arguments in war councils are the ones that end quickly. The Dúnedain were most effective in open ground, in the dark, operating in pairs with room to move. Put them behind walls, and you had wasted them. Tormund had looked at him for a long moment, and then said, in the tone of a man revising an opinion, "You've done this before." "Something like it," Aragorn said. Now he sat on his horse in the darkness before the gate with 11 rangers spread in a loose arc behind him, Halbarad at his right shoulder as always, the others spaced for mutual support and individual freedom of movement, and watched the dead come. They were different from Sauron's servants. He had known they would be, had told himself so during the council, and yet the reality of them still required a moment of adjustment. The orcs and Uruk-hai of Mordor were corrupted living things, creatures of malice and appetite, loud and brutal and susceptible to fear even when they refused to show it. These dead were none of that. They moved with the horrible efficiency of things that had shed every unnecessary quality. No rage, no hunger, no self-preservation, only direction, purpose without personality. They came across the snow in a mass that the torchlight barely reached the edge of, and the sound they made was the sound of an avalanche that had decided to be patient about it. And Durrell came out of its scabbard. The blade caught the torchlight and threw it back cold and clear. And along the edge something moved that was not quite reflection, a quality of light that the elvish smiths had worked into the steel when they reforged it from the shards of Narsil, a luminescence that responded to the presence of darkness the way a compass responds to north. It had not done this against orcs. It had not done this against the Nazgul. It was doing it now, and what that meant about the nature of what was coming across the snow was a thought Aragorn set aside for later. "Rangers," he said. His voice was quiet. It carried anyway. "We are not holding the line. We are buying time and making noise and drawing attention. We strike and we move. We do not stand and fight anything that is not fightable. If something cannot be killed, you ride away from it and you find me. Is that understood?" 11 quiet affirmatives. Halbarad. "Here. Stay alive." A pause. "I'll make every effort." The first wave reached them, and Aragorn rode into it. Later, in the fractured, non-linear way that battle memory always works, he would recall it in pieces. The way Andúril moved through the first white, and the thing simply stopped. The animated malice that had been operating it extinguished as cleanly as a candle. The body dropping into the snow with the finality of something that had been allowed, at last, to be properly dead. The discovery, made in the first 30 seconds, that the blade's effect on the dead was total and immediate, not the slow work of hewing through orc armor, but instant cessation, as though the light in the steel was the specific antidote to whatever animated these things. He filed this information away with the part of his mind that kept working during battle regardless of what the rest of him was doing. The Dúnedain fought the way they always fought, without flourish, without wasted motion, with the economic precision of men for whom combat was a craft practiced over decades. He caught glimpses of them between his own engagements. Rian taking a white's head with 2 economical strokes. Dunther and Failder working in their habitual partnership, one drawing while the other cut. They were good. They were very good. And the dead kept coming. What he noticed, what he filed away for the council, if there was a council afterward, was the moment the White Walker appeared on the ridge. It came on a dead horse, pale as the snow and twice as cold, and it did not engage. It watched. It stood at the edge of the torchlight's reach and observed the Dúnedain with the attention of a general, assessing an unexpected variable. And Aragorn, in the half-second between killing one white and turning to face another, looked directly at it and felt something he had not felt since the Pelennor. Recognition, coming from the other direction. The White Walker was looking at Andúral's light, looking at it with something that was not quite surprise. The dead did not do surprise, but was its functional equivalent. An adjustment, a recalculation. Then it raised one hand, and the nearest 100 whites turned, in unison, toward Aragorn. On the walls above, he heard Jon Snow shouting orders. He heard the dragons, heard them before he saw them. The massive percussive sound of wings that displaced serious quantities of air. And then Drogon came over the wall in a wash of orange light, and the world became fire and screaming. And the specific chaos of a battle that has just changed shape entirely. Aragorn wheeled his horse and cut his way back toward the gate. "Fall back," he called to the rangers. Inside. Now. They came. All of them. He counted as they rode through the gate, and the gate ground shut behind them. And the number was 11, and for one suspended moment, he allowed himself to feel the relief of that before the walls began to shake. The Night King did not hurry. This was the thing Aragorn kept returning to in the hours after the first assault. Not the scale of the army. Not the cold that deepened with every passing minute. Not even the moment on the ridge when the White Walker's attention had found him like a blade finding a gap in armor. What he kept returning to was the pace. The dead moved at the speed of inevitability, which is to say they moved at exactly the speed required and no faster. Because hurrying implied the possibility of being too late, and the Night King had never been too late for anything. Aragorn knew this quality. He had felt it in Sauron's campaigns. The dark patience of an intelligence that measured time in centuries and treated individual battles as single moves. In a game whose board was the entire world, it was the patience of something that had watched civilizations rise and fall and had learned that the living always, eventually, made the mistake that undid them. All it had to do was wait for that mistake. He was in the Great Hall with Jon and Daenerys, and the surviving members of the council when Bran was wheeled in by Theon, and the change in the young man's bearing was immediately apparent. The distant quality that always inhabited him had deepened into something approaching complete absence, as though the person who normally operated his face had stepped away and left only the older, vaster thing that occasionally used it. "He's seen something," Jon said. "He's always seen something," Davos muttered. "The question is whether he'll tell us what it is in actual words or in something we'll only understand 3 hours after it becomes relevant." Bran looked at Aragorn. "The Night King knows you," he said. The room shifted. Aragorn kept his expression neutral. "Explain." "Not you specifically," Bran said. And there was something in the flat register of his voice that suggested he was translating from a language that did not map cleanly onto human speech. "What you carry, what you are. He has seen your kind of light before. Long ago. Before the wall. Before the first men." His ancient eyes moved to Andúral, still sheathed at Aragorn's hip. "There was a weapon like that once. In the First War. It burned the same way. He destroyed it." A pause. "He didn't enjoy the destroying." That surprised him. It surprised him that he didn't enjoy it, Jaime said, from the corner. It surprised him that it was possible to surprise him, Bran said. He thought he had accounted for everything. He hadn't accounted for light from outside. He looked back at Aragorn. He's accountable for it now. He's redirecting. How much of his attention? Aragorn asked. Enough that it will cost you. Enough that it might cost everyone else less. Bran's expression, to the extent that Bran had an expression, held something that might have been the ghost of an apology. He sees you as a problem to be solved before the main work begins. You are a variable he cannot fully calculate. Variables disturb him. Good, Halbarad said, from behind Aragorn's left shoulder. He said it quietly, with the satisfaction of a man who had spent his life being a variable that disturbed the calculations of darkness. The intelligence this provided was double-edged, and everyone in the room understood it simultaneously. On one side, the Night King's redirected attention meant the walls were buying time. they might not have otherwise bought. That the full weight of the dead's organizational capacity was partially occupied with the question of Aragorn rather than the question of the gate. On the other side, the Night King's redirected attention was the Night King's redirected attention, and whatever it brought to bear on Aragorn would be specific, purposeful, and calibrated. Daenerys, to her considerable credit, identified the tactical implication first. If he's focused on you, she said to Aragorn, we can use that. You want to use me as bait, Aragorn said. Not an accusation, a clarification. I want to use the fact that you've already become bait, she said, and make it deliberate rather than accidental. There's a difference. Aragorn looked at her. She met his gaze with the level self-possession of someone who had spent a long time making decisions that cost other people dearly and had learned to make them clearly rather than quickly. What do you propose? He asked. You and your rangers move to the Godswood. With Bran, you become the thing he's moving toward, and we know exactly where that is, and we plan everything else around that point. She paused. It changes the shape of the battle. Instead of him directing everything at the walls while reaching for you, we give him a direct line and he takes it, and the walls get a chance. And in the Godswood, Jon said, he has to come to us. He has to come himself. His jaw was tight. That's always been the point. Get him close enough to. He stopped. To what? Aragorn asked. Jon and Daenerys exchanged the look again, the one that contained the conversation they had been having for weeks about, something they could not say plainly, because saying it plainly would require confronting how thin the plan actually was. There is someone, Jon said carefully, who may be able to end this. If the Night King can be brought to the Godswood, if he can be made to believe he's already won. Who? Halbarad asked. Jon looked toward the door, and Aragorn followed his gaze and found a young woman leaning against the doorframe, small, dark-haired still, with eyes like chips of flint and the particular quality of motionlessness that Aragorn associated with the Dúnedain at their most dangerous. She had been there long enough that he wasn't sure when she'd arrived, which told him a great deal about her. She looked at Aragorn with frank, unsentimental assessment. He looked back. Arya, Jon said. This is Aragorn. I know who he is, she said. She had been listening, then, for some time. She pushed off the doorframe. Bran told me. A ranger from another world. Her eyes went to Andúril. Does it actually kill them? Yes, Aragorn said. Good, she said. The same word Halbarad had used. The same quiet satisfaction. And Aragorn felt the sudden, strong sense of a world arranging itself around a point, all the moving pieces of this terrible night, finding their geometry, the pattern resolving the way of battle, sometimes resolved in the last hour before dawn, when you could suddenly see the shape of what was possible if everything went exactly right and nothing went catastrophically wrong. He had learned, over 88 years, not to trust that feeling. He had also learned that sometimes it was correct. The outer wall fell at the third hour. Aragorn heard it from the Godswood, a sound like the world clearing its throat, deep and final, followed by the particular silence that follows catastrophic structural failure, the silence of a large thing that has stopped being what it was. Then the screaming began, and the screaming was different from the screaming of the first assault. The first assault's screaming had been fear. This was something beyond fear. The sound of people discovering that the thing they had built their last hope upon had just become rubble. He did not go to the wall. This was the hardest thing he had done since arriving in this world. Harder than the council argument. Harder than riding into the first wave of the dead. And he did this because every instinct in his body was pulling him toward the sound of people dying and away from the Godswood and the plan. And overriding instinct with strategy was the specific discipline that separated a soldier from a commander. Commanders sent people to walls. Commanders stayed at the point that mattered. He gripped Andúril's hilt and stayed. Around him the Godswood breathed its strange cold breath. It was unlike any forest he had known. The weirwood at its center enormous and pale, its carved face ancient beyond reckoning, its red sap moving in the torchlight like something that had not quite decided whether to be alive or not. The Dúnedain were positioned throughout the trees in the formation he had set them. Pairs at the three approach paths. Two singles covering the elevated ground to the north. Halbarad beside him at the weirwood itself. Bran sat before the tree in his chair, eyes already rolled back to white. already somewhere else entirely, his body present and his self utterly absent. Theon Greyjoy stood at Bran's right with a spear and the expression of a man who has decided, after a long and complicated life of making wrong choices, to make one right one at whatever cost the universe decides to charge. Aragorn had spoken briefly with him during the repositioning. 5 minutes. No more. The kind of conversation you have with people when time is short and truth is the only currency worth spending. You don't have to be here, Aragorn had said. Theon had looked at him with the eyes of someone who had been broken and rebuilt and was still, apparently, standing. Yes, I do, he said simply. Aragorn had nodded and moved on, and he carried the weight of that simple declaration with him now as the sounds of Winterfell's collapse rolled through the cold air. What came through the Godswood's northern approach first was not the dead. It was the living, a broken stream of them. Soldiers who had been on the outer wall when it fell and had run rather than fought, which was the correct decision, and one that Aragorn did not judge because he had made the same calculation himself at Amon Hen and knew exactly what it cost a person to make it. They came through the trees in ones and twos, disarmed or clutching weapons they had forgotten to use, faces emptied by shock. Aragorn stepped into the path of the first group. They pulled up, hands going to weapons that were already gone. Easy, he said. His voice was the voice he had used on the Pelennor, not loud, not sharp, but carrying an authority that reached people in the specific register where panic lived and offered it something else to hold on to. You are not finished. Look at me. He waited until their eyes found his. You are not finished. There is work left to do, and you are going to do it. Come. It was not a complicated thing he was doing. It was not strategy or tactics or the subtle work of council argument. It was the oldest and simplest of the things a leader does, the thing that could not be planned or systematized or replicated by anyone who did not mean it absolutely. He was refusing, on behalf of everyone present, to accept that this was over. He was refusing it with his body and his voice and the particular quality of his attention, which was the attention of a man who had stood in worse places and found that standing was still possible. The soldiers stopped running. Not all of them. Some were too far gone in their fear, too hollowed, and these he let pass, because forcing broken people into a fight they cannot survive serves no one. But enough stopped. 6, then 9, then 14, clustering around the Dúnedain positions, in the Godswood with the slightly dazed quality of people who have been caught mid-fall and are still working out whether the ground is solid. Halbarad moved among them quietly, redistributing weapons, placing people, speaking in the low, efficient murmur he used when there was too much to do and not enough time to do it in. This too was what the Dúnedain did, not only the fighting but the holding together of the people around the fighting, the unglamorous work of keeping the living functional in the proximity of the dead. The first whites came through the eastern approach at a run. 3 of them, then 7, then a mass, the vanguard of something larger pressing through the trees. Gunther and Faelder met them at the approach line, and Aragorn heard the clean, purposeful sounds of rangers working, no shouting, no wasted effort, only the sounds of blades finding their marks. But there were too many coming now, the dead pressing through every gap in the treeline, and Aragorn moved. He moved the way he always moved in the deep of a fight, not with the explosive dramatic energy of a younger warrior, but with the settled, economical force of someone who had learned that the body is a finite resource and must be spent wisely. And Durrell carved through the dead, and they fell and stayed fallen, which was still, after everything, a relief. The soldiers who had stopped running watched him for one transfixed moment, and then, this too was the oldest thing, the thing that could not be manufactured. They followed, not because he had ordered them to, because he had not stopped. The dead came in greater numbers, and the Godswood became a close, terrible place of shadow and cold fire. And Aragorn fought through it with the rangers and the broken soldiers who had decided not to be broken. And above them, the weirwood's carved face watched everything with its red wooden eyes. And somewhere in the middle distance, the Night King was coming, steady and unhurried, toward the light that bothered him. The Dúnedain died the way they had lived, without ceremony, without retreat, in the dark, doing the thing that needed doing. which was buying time for people who did not yet know they needed it bought. Rian was first. Aragorn did not see it happen. He was 30 yards away, cutting through a press of whites at the eastern approach when he heard Halberad's voice change. Quality in the way it only changed when something had gone irreversibly wrong, but he reconstructed it afterward from what the survivors told him, piecing it together the way you piece together a thing you wish you did not have to know. Rian had been covering the northern path with a young Northman named Calder when a White Walker came through the treeline, not the general from the ridge, a different one, younger in whatever sense the word applied to things that had stopped aging, moving faster than the whites moved and with actual intention behind its movement. Rian had put himself between it and Calder and bought the young man 4 seconds in his own life, and Calder had used those 4 seconds to run, which was what Rian had intended. Aragorn had known Rian for 31 years. He had attended the man's wedding in the angle and carried his first son on his shoulders and ridden beside him through every season of darkness the North had offered. He filed this knowledge in the part of himself that had been filing this kind of knowledge for decades, the part that was simply a long list of names of people who had died in the darkness, while the darkness remained and kept moving, because stopping was not something the situation permitted. Dúnedain fell at the weirwood's edge, pulled down by a mass of whites that came through the southern gap simultaneously, too many to cut through before they overwhelmed by simple weight of numbers. He did not cry out. Aragorn heard Faelder's sharp breath, the sound of a man losing the person he had fought beside for 20 years, and then heard Faelder continue fighting, which was both devastating and correct. Faelder himself lasted another 20 minutes. The thing about fighting the dead was that it never paused. Against living enemies there were moments, the natural ebb of a battle, the seconds between engagements when you could breathe and assess and find your companions with your eyes and verify they were still standing. Against the dead there were no such moments because the dead did not need moments. They pressed with the absolute consistency of a tide, and the living burned through their reserves of strength and attention and response time, and there was nothing coming back in. Aragorn was aware of himself tiring. He had not tired like this since the Paths of the Dead, a different kind of exhaustion than the physical, something that reached into the older reserves, the ones that a man did not know he was spending until they were nearly gone. And Durrell felt its proper weight and no more than its proper weight, but his arm felt the accumulation of every stroke. And there were moments now between engagements where he found himself doing the calculation he had taught himself never to do. How many more, and for how long? And at what point does the math stop working? He forced the calculation out and replaced it with the next 10 seconds. This was the discipline, not the battle, not the night, not the vast weight of the enemy, only the next 10 seconds. And then the 10 after those. Halberad appeared at his left shoulder, bleeding from a cut above his eye that he had not bothered to address, with the look on his face that Aragorn associated with difficult truths, delivered without embellishment. "We've lost 4, Halberad said. Rian, Dúnedain, Faelder, and Callan. Aragorn absorbed this. The others? Holding. Barely. The soldiers from the wall are fighting well. Better than they were. A pause. The dead are getting thicker from the north. Something is pushing them. He did not say what that something was. He did not need to. How long have we been in here? Aragorn asked. Long enough, Halberad said, which was not an answer and was also the only accurate one. In the center of the godswood, Bran sat motionless before the weirwood, gone wherever the three-eyed raven went. His body a still point around which everything else moved. Theon was still standing beside him, still standing, which was in itself a kind of miracle. His spear dark with white fluid, his face set in the specific expression of a man who has located his purpose late and is holding on to it with everything he has left. A sound came from the north, not the sound of the dead, which was the absence of sound more than sound itself. The rustle and drag of things that moved without, the noise that living things make, the silence of no breath, no heartbeat, no fear. This was different. This was the sound of cold becoming intentional, of temperature dropping not because of weather but because of will. The trees at the godswood's northern edge began to frost, not the gradual frost of a cold night, but the instant frost of something draining the warmth from Everything it approached, the bark cracking under sudden ice, the ground hardening audibly underfoot. Theon turned toward the sound. His knuckles went white on the spear. Aragorn turned too, and beside him he felt rather than heard. Halbarad go still in the way the Dúnedain went still when they were setting themselves for something final. The Night King walked into the Godswood. He came alone, or apparently alone, which was not the same thing, because behind him the trees were full of the dead, and the dead were full of him. His presence distributed through them like cold through water. He was taller than Aragorn had expected and quieter, and the quality of his gaze was the quality of something that had observed the end of every previous version of this moment, and was now observing this one with the patience of complete foreknowledge. He looked at Bran. Then he looked at Aragorn. And in the look was the thing that Bran had described in the war room, the recognition, the recalculation, the adjustment of a vast and ancient intelligence to an input it had not fully accounted for. The light of Andúril was throwing its cold luminescence through the dark, and the Night King was looking at it the way a man looks at a fire that should not exist in a place where fire has no right to burn. Theon, son of Balon Greyjoy, reaved and broken and rebuilt and standing, looked at the Night King and then at Aragorn, and in his eyes was a question. Aragorn answered it. Now, he said quietly. Theon screamed his house words to no one and everyone and charged. Theon died well. There was no other way to say it and no better way to honor it. He crossed the distance between himself and the Night King with the screaming recklessness of a man who had spent a long time being afraid of the wrong things and had finally, in this last moment, found the right thing to be unafraid of. The Night King caught the spear with one hand and stopped it without apparent effort and looked at Theon with the flat assessment of something, cataloging an obstacle. And then he did the thing that the Night King did to obstacles. And Theon Greyjoy fell into the snow and did not rise. What he had done, what his charge had accomplished, was give Aragorn 4 seconds of the Night King's peripheral attention. It was enough. Not to end it. Not to do the thing that the plan required. The thing that only Arya could do and that Arya was not yet here to do. But enough to cover the distance between where Aragorn had been standing and where he needed to be. Enough to bring Andúril up in the arc he had been calculating since the Night King walked into the Godswood. The stroke that was not aimed at ending but at testing. Finding the answer to the question that had been sitting at the back of everything since the blade had begun to glow. At the first sight of the dead, Andúril connected. The Night King's reaction was not pain. Aragorn did not think the Night King experienced pain in any sense that corresponded to the word, but it was something. A recoil, a withdrawal, physical, and something more than physical. The way a hand withdraws from a heat that exceeds its expectation. The ice that perpetually rhymed the Night King's armor cracked along the shoulder, where the blade had touched, and the cracks spread outward in a pattern that looked less like damage and more like the light finding gaps in something that had believed itself to have no gaps. The Night King looked at the wound. Then he looked at Aragorn with an attention so complete and so singular that Aragorn felt it as a physical pressure, the full focus of something ancient and vast and accustomed to being the most dangerous thing in any given location. Now revising that assessment. Around them the dead went still. Not all of them. The wights at the treeline continued their press, the grinding mechanical advance that never paused. But the ones nearest the weirwood stopped. And the quality of the stillness was the stillness of things waiting for instruction from a consciousness that had temporarily redirected elsewhere. The Dúnedain used the pause. He heard them moving in the trees, reorganizing, pulling the wounded soldiers back, buying the space that the Night King's distraction was briefly offering. Aragorn pressed. He was not foolish enough to believe he could kill this thing. He had tested the blade against it and found that the blade could touch it, could damage it in some real sense, could cause it to withdraw and recalculate. And this was more than anyone had managed before him with ordinary steel. But it was not the same as killing. The Night King's wounds were already closing, the ice reforming along his shoulder, with the slow inevitability of a tide coming back in. And what Aragorn was doing now was not fighting to win, but fighting to occupy, to keep the Night King's attention locked on him, to make himself the most pressing problem in the Godswood, to buy the seconds that the plan required. The Night King raised his hand. The dead Dúnedain rose. This was the moment Aragorn had known was coming. From the instant Halbarad told him, the Count of the Fallen, the moment he had been bracing for since. Bran described the Night King's power in the war room, and it was worse than bracing had prepared him for, because knowing a thing intellectually and confronting it physically are two entirely different experiences, and the body does not care what the mind has accepted in advance. Rian stood up. Gunther stood up. Filder and Kaelin stood up. They rose from the snow where they had fallen with the horrible, smooth motion of the dead, which contained no stiffness, no hesitation, none of the physical evidence of recent death that should have been there. And they turned toward Aragorn with the empty faces of things that had been his brothers, and were now only shapes, wearing his brothers' faces. He had known this was possible. He had not known how much it would cost him to see it. For one moment, one breath, one suspended instant, the discipline failed. Not catastrophically, not completely, but enough that the Night King noticed and tilted his head, with the minute satisfaction of something that has found the precise location of a wound. He raised his other hand, and the dead Dúnedain began to move toward Aragorn with the awful purposefulness of the fully controlled. And in their empty eyes was no recognition, no remnant of the men they had been. Only the Night Kings while operating through borrowed bodies. Halbarad's voice came from the darkness to Aragorn's left. Don't. One word. Aragorn had heard Halbarad say more with one word than most men managed in a sentence for 40 years. He breathed. He found the place in himself that had been forged in the same fires as Andúril. The place that did not yield. Not to grief, not to despair, not to the specific cruelty of an enemy that used your dead against you because it had understood, somehow, that this was the most precise way to reach you. He found it, and he stood in it, and he raised the blade. Forgive me, he said quietly, to Rian and Gunther and Filder and Kaelin, to the shapes that wore their faces and contained nothing of them, because the men themselves were gone, and what remained was only an insult in their likeness. Then he did what needed doing. Andúril moved through them with the same clean finality it had brought to every wight in the godswood, and the dead Dúnedain fell again. And this time they did not rise. The Night King watched this with his recalibrating attention, and in the watching was something that Aragorn had not expected to find in a creature of such absolute cold frustration. The Night King had used the most precise weapon in his arsenal, the specific, targeted cruelty of returning a man's dead to him as enemies. And it had not worked. The man was still standing. The blade was still burning. The plan, whatever the plan was still in motion. The Night King stepped forward. Aragorn stepped forward to meet him and felt, in the frozen air of the godswood, the full weight of what he was. Not the heir of Isildur, not the future king, not the ranger of the north navigating a world that was not his, but simply a man who had decided, 88 years ago on a cold night in the wilderness, that the darkness was not going to have everything it wanted, and had been keeping that decision every day since. Andúril rose. Something moved in the shadows. At the godswood's edge. Small. Fast. Utterly silent. The Night King sensed it a half-second before it arrived. Aragorn saw the ancient head begin to turn, saw the recalculation, starting, and drove the blade forward. Not to kill, but to redirect. Andúril's light flooding the Night King's vision in the precise moment that Arya Stark came out of the darkness, with a blade and a falling knife switched at her brother would never have thought of and her teachers would not have sanctioned. The knife caught the light as it fell. Aragorn saw it in the fragment of a second that the world sometimes offers in the deep of a critical moment, a sliver of perceived time that is not actually longer than normal time but feels that way, because everything non-essential has been stripped from awareness, and only the relevant remains. The blade was dragonglass, he registered. Small, perfectly placed. Arya's left hand had dropped it from her, right in the transfer that no one who had not been specifically trained to expect it could have anticipated, and her right hand caught it at the precise angle required and drove it upward into the Night King's armored chest. The sound it made was the sound of ice breaking from the inside. The Night King looked down. Then he looked at Arya Stark with the expression, if expression was the word for what moved across that ancient face, of something confronting, a variable it had failed to account for in a calculation. It had believed complete. Not rage. Not pain. Something closer to the specific. Bewilderment of an intelligence so vast and so old that surprise had become structurally impossible, and was now apparently not. He shattered. There was no other word for it. He did not fall, did not bleed, did not die in any of the ways that living things die. He came apart, the ice of him fracturing outward from the point of Arya's blade in a network of cracks that spread faster than the I could follow. And then he was simply not there. And the sound of his unmaking was the sound of every frozen thing in the godswood releasing. Simultaneously, a vast exhalation, as though the world had been holding its breath for 10,000 years, and had just remembered how to let it go. The dead fell, all of them, all at once. The whites at the tree-line, the press at the eastern approach, the mass moving through the outer courtyards of Winterfell, they dropped in the same instant with the boneless finality of puppets whose strings have been cut by a single stroke, and the silence that followed was the deepest silence Aragorn had heard since the moment before the gates of Mordor, the silence of an evil so pervasive that its absence registered as a physical change in the quality of the air. Arya stood in the center of the godswood with the dragonglass blade in her hand and looked at the place where the Night King had been. Aragorn looked at her. She was breathing hard, the only sign that what she had done had cost her anything, and her face held the particular expression he had seen on the faces of people who have survived the unsurvivable and have not yet caught up to that fact emotionally. She was 17 years old, or thereabouts, and she had just ended a 10,000-year winter, and she was looking at the empty air where the Night King had stood with the eyes of someone who had been preparing for this moment for so long that its arrival felt less like victory than like the sudden removal of a weight she had forgotten how to stand without. He walked to her. He said nothing. There was nothing to say that the moment did not already contain, and he put his hand briefly on her shoulder in the way that he would have done for any of his rangers after a thing that could not be undone and should not be unremarked. She looked up at him. Did we lose people? Yes, he said. She absorbed this the way people absorb it when they are already full of loss and are finding room for more. How many of yours? 4, he said. Rian, Gunther, Failder, Kalen. She was quiet for a moment. I'm sorry. They died as rangers die, Aragorn said, buying time for what mattered. What mattered happened. He looked at her steadily. Because of you. Arya looked away. She was not comfortable with that. He could see it. The way she deflected the weight of what she had done back outward, toward the practical, toward the next thing, which was a quality he recognized because he had spent most of his own life doing the same thing. It was the quality of people, raised to do necessary things in the dark without expectation of acknowledgement. And it was both their greatest strength and the wound they carried. So long they stopped noticing it. The godswood was full of the sounds of the aftermath, the living finding each other, names being called, the particular staggered quality of voices that have survived, something they had not fully believed they would survive. Halbarad emerged from the trees with 3 remaining rangers at his back and the cut above, his eyes still unaddressed, and looked at the empty air where the Night King had been, and then at Aragorn with the expression of a man revising his expectations upward. It's done, he said. It's done, Aragorn said. Halbarad looked at the sky, which was beginning, barely, tentatively, with the hesitance of something that had been gone so long it was uncertain of its welcome, to lighten in the east. Not dawn, not yet, but the promise of dawn. The sky's memory of what came before darkness, offering itself cautiously back. The others? Aragorn asked. Berian and Maedhon are wounded. Maedhon badly. Halbarad's voice was level. The rest are standing. 8 of 13. Aragorn held the number for a moment and then said it, alongside the other numbers he carried. The count of every company he had ever led into darkness. The tally that a commander accumulates over a long enough life of leading people into necessary danger. He had learned, very early, that these numbers did not diminish with time. They did not become easier to carry. They only became more familiar weight, distributed across older shoulders. Bran Stark's eyes rolled forward. He came back into himself with the slow, surfacing quality of someone returning from a very great distance. And he looked around the Godswood with the expression of a person, relearning where and when he was. His eyes found Aragorn and held there. You held him, Bran said. Long enough. Your sister did the work, Aragorn said. She did, Bran agreed. But he would have turned before she reached him. He was beginning to turn. A pause. You kept his attention on the light. On Andúril. His ancient eyes moved to the blade. He was trying to understand it. He had never seen anything like it. Light from outside his world. Outside his calculation. It occupied him. Another pause. The pause of someone choosing words for a thing that does not have natural words. You were the distraction that was not a distraction. The thing that was genuinely dangerous. That he could not stop watching. Because it was genuinely dangerous. Aragorn said nothing. He was looking at the lightning sky and thinking about, for men who would not see it, and about all the other men across Winterfell and the killing fields, beyond who would not see it, and about the cost that was always the cost, the one that did not change regardless of whether the victory was complete. From beyond the Godswood, across the broken courtyards of Winterfell, came the sounds of the living beginning the long work of finding each other in the wreckage. Names called out in the specific, urgent cadence of people who need to know who remains. The sounds of grief and relief arriving in the same moment, often from the same throat. Jon Snow's voice carried over all of it, steady and hoarse, calling for order with the voice of a man who had died and come back and understood. Therefore, that coming back carried obligation. Aragorn sheathed Andúril. The light in the blade faded slowly, as though reluctant, as though it too had found something worth burning. For in this world, and was not entirely certain it was finished, dawn came to Winterfell like an apology, not the triumphant sunrise of songs and stories, not the golden flood of light that the bards would eventually manufacture for this morning, when they got around to manufacturing things about it, but a gray, tentative brightening, the sky lightening by degrees as though uncertain it had permission, as though 10,000 years of the long night had taught even the sun to be cautious about returning. It came anyway. It always did. That, Aragorn supposed, was the thing about light. It did not require invitation, only the absence of what had been blocking it. He spent the first hours of it doing the work that came after. This was the work that the songs left out, that the stories compressed into a single line about the days of healing that followed, as though healing were a destination rather than a process, as though the living simply arrived at it the morning after the darkness broke and found themselves there. The reality was bodies in the snow and the wounded who had survived the night, only to discover that surviving the night had costs that were still being tallied. The reality was Athelas. He had 3 sprigs of it, carried habitually in the inner pocket of his weathered coat, a ranger's reflex, packing Athelas the way other men packed flint and steel, because you never knew and it weighed nothing. And the day always came when you needed it. 3 sprigs for a castle full of wounded, which was not enough and was also everything he had. He used it carefully. The maester, a small, precise, deeply skeptical man named Wolkin, who had spent the night in the crypts and emerged into the aftermath with the expression of someone who had not expected to emerge at all, watched Aragorn work with the Athelas over the worst of the wounded cases, and said nothing for a long time. Then he said, in the careful tone of a man who has built his identity around the boundaries of knowledge, and is having those boundaries relocated without his consent. What is that? A herb, Aragorn said. That is not what herbs do, Wolkin said. In my world, sometimes it is. Wolkin watched for another moment, then moved to help without further comment, which was the response of a man who had decided that outcomes mattered more than explanations. Aragorn filed this away as another data point in his growing assessment of the people of this world, pragmatic in the specific way of people who have survived by being pragmatic, quick to revise, unburdened by the need to have their categories confirmed before they acted. Maedhon he saved. The wound was deep, a White Walker's touch, which had worked a cold into the tissue that ordinary treatment would not have reached, but the Athelas found it and drew it out over the course of 2 hours' careful work. And Maedhon opened his eyes in the gray morning light and looked at Aragorn with the expression of a man who has been somewhere very dark and is still deciding whether the light is real. Rest, Aragorn told him, in Sindarin. because in the moment it was the first language his care reached for. Then, in the common tongue, rest. It's done. Varian's wound was simpler, a deep cut across the ribs that needed closing, and the remaining 6 Rangers were upright and functional, wearing their grief in the private, contained manner of men who had been carrying grief for a long time and knew where it went. Halbarad found him in the late morning, sitting on the steps of Winterfell's great hall with his back against the stone and his eyes on the middle distance. He sat beside Aragorn without preamble, and for a while they did not speak, which was one of the advantages of 40 years of friendship, the ability to be present with someone in silence without the silence requiring explanation. Jon Snow wants to speak with you, Halbarad said eventually. I know. Daenerys Targaryen wants to speak with you. I know. Sansa Stark sent someone to find you twice. I know. A pause. Are you going to speak with any of them? Yes. Aragorn looked at the sky, still gray, still cautious. In a moment, Halbarad nodded and let the moment be what it was. After a while he said, quietly, Rian would have complained about the cold. He complained about everything, Aragorn said. He did. A pause. He was very good at it. He was the best, Aragorn agreed. And the grief sat between them, clean and honest. Not performed, not suppressed. Simply present, the accurate weight of 4 men who had deserved better than an unmarked death in a world that was not theirs, and had given everything they had to it anyway. The conversations, when Aragorn finally had them, were long and complicated, and covered ground that he had known would need covering since the moment the battle ended. Jon Snow wanted to know about the rift, whether it could be found, whether it could be used, whether there was any way to understand how it had opened. Aragorn told him honestly that he did not know, that the elves of his world might have understood it better than he did, that the magic, if magic was what it was, had not consulted him before depositing him here and had offered no instructions for return. Jon absorbed this with the equanimity of a man accustomed to incomplete information. And if you can't find the way back, then I will find a way to be useful here, Aragorn said simply. That has always been the plan. Daenerys was more direct. She had the directness of someone who had spent a long time being underestimated and had learned to economize. She wanted to know what Andúril was, what it was made of, whether there were other weapons like it in his world, and whether they could be brought through, if the rift could be reopened. He answered what he could and acknowledged what he couldn't, and she listened with the focused attention of a ruler taking inventory of resources. And at the end she said, You fought well. Your men died well. Winterfell will remember their names. They would not have asked for that, Aragorn said. No, she said. But the dead do not get to decide how the living remember them. He thought about that for a long time afterward. Sansa found him at dusk, standing at the grave markers that the surviving Rangers had made for their 4 dead, simple markers, cut from the weirwood's fallen branches by Halbarad's knife, each bearing a name in the Tengwar script that would mean nothing to anyone in this world, but meant everything to the men who made them. She stood beside him in silence for a moment. Then, You're thinking about whether to stay. I'm thinking about many things, Aragorn said. That's one of them. It was not a question. She looked at the markers. They died for a world that wasn't theirs. They died for the living, Aragorn said. The living are the living in any world. Sansa was quiet for a moment. If you find the way back, will you tell us? Before you go, he looked at her. In the dusk light, she had the quality of someone who had been reshaped by everything that had happened to her, and was still, stubbornly, recognizably herself beneath all of it. He thought again of the Dúnedain. He thought of what she might have been, raised differently, in different soil. Yes, he said. I will tell you. She nodded once and walked back toward the castle, and Aragorn stood at the graves of his rangers in the first full dark that was only dark, that contained nothing worse than the cold and the stars, the right stars. He noticed, or closer to right, as though the Night King's ending had adjusted something in the sky, and he stood there until Halbarad came to find him and bring him in. In the weeks that followed the long night, the North changed in ways that no maester would fully capture and no song would fully contain. The dead were burned, all of them, whites and fallen soldiers together, in pyres that burned for 3 days and sent columns of smoke into a sky that grew incrementally warmer. The survivors of Winterfell moved through the aftermath with the particular quality of people who have been to the edge of the world's ending and come back to discover that the world, despite everything, still requires feeding and repairing and governing. Life reasserted itself with the stubborn, unglamorous persistence that it always does, not as triumph, but as continuation. Aragorn and the 8 remaining Dúnedain stayed through the burning and the burying and the long, complicated work of the days after. He sat in councils and offered what he knew, tended the wounded with the last of his Athelas, and then, with what Wolkan taught him of local medicine, and walked the walls of Winterfell, each morning at dawn in the habit of a man who has spent his life keeping watch and does not know how to stop. The rift was never found. He sent Halbarad north to look, and Halbarad went with 3 rangers and returned after 10 days to report only forest and snow, and the fading scar of something that had opened and closed and left no door behind it. Aragorn received this news without surprise. The roads between worlds did not stay open for the convenience of travelers. He had arrived here by the intention of something larger than himself, and if that something had not seen fit to provide a return, then the intention was perhaps that he remain. He found, to his own quiet surprise, that he could bear this. The north was not his north, but it was a north, cold and hard and full of people who endured because endurance was what they knew, who kept watch in the darkness because someone had to, who understood that the work was never finished and did it anyway. He recognized them. He recognized the landscape of it, the specific moral weather of a place that had been shaped by long struggle into something spare and true. Sansa Stark, in the political reckoning that followed the Night King's fall, proved exactly what Aragorn had suspected she would prove: formidable, clear-eyed, undeceived by the euphoria of survival into believing that survival had solved anything. She came to him 3 weeks after the battle with a proposal that was really a question, wrapped in practical language. The North would need rangers, people who knew how to move in darkness, how to track what should not be tracked, how to stand between the living and whatever came next. The Dúnedain were 8. The North was vast. Would he teach? He looked at her for a long moment and thought about Rivendell, where Elrond had taken a boy with a difficult inheritance and made him into something capable of carrying it. He thought about what it meant to pass a thing forward, not as legacy or monument, but as living practice, as the daily work of keeping the darkness at a distance that the living could survive. Yes, he said, I will teach. Arya left before the first snow of the new season, heading west, or so she said, toward whatever the edge of the known map offered someone who had already done the thing everyone said was impossible and found. It left her restless rather than satisfied. She came to find Aragorn the morning she rode out, in the gray early light before the castle was properly awake, and she stood before him with the particular quality of someone who has something to say and is working out whether to say it. In your world, she said, is there always a way? He understood the question. It was not about routes or roads or rifts between worlds. It was the question underneath all questions, the one that every person who had ever stood in the dark with a blade and insufficient odds had eventually asked themselves. No, he said, not always. She absorbed this. But you keep going anyway. Yes. She looked at him for a moment longer, then nodded, the nod of someone filing something away in the part of themselves that they actually use, and rode out through Winterfell's gate into the gray morning without looking back. He watched her go and thought that whatever world she eventually found the edge of, it would have to work very hard to be ready for her. The stars continued their slow correction. By midwinter they were almost right, almost the stars of home, displaced only slightly, close enough that on clear nights, Aragorn could stand on Winterfell's battlements and find the constellations Elrond had taught him and feel, not the piercing homesickness of the first weeks, but something gentler, the recognition of someone who has learned to find the familiar inside the foreign, who has made peace with a longer road than the one originally planned. Halbarad stood beside him on one such night, their breath making small clouds in the cold, the castle quiet below them. Do you think we'll find it? Halbarad said. The way back. Aragorn considered the stars, considered the 8 men behind him, the graves of the 4 ahead of him. The north spread out below in its winter dark, lit here and there by the fires of people who were alive because of what had been paid. I think, he said carefully, that if the road home exists, it will find us when we have finished what we are here to do. And when will that be? Aragorn looked at the horizon. Somewhere out there, beyond the walls of the castle and the borders of the north, and the edge of every map that anyone in this world had drawn, something was always beginning. Something was always requiring attention. The work was never finished. It had never been finished. That was not a reason to despair. It was simply the nature of the work. I don't know, he said, but I intend to find out. The north was dark and cold and full of people worth protecting. He could think of worse places to keep watch. May the Force, may whatever power guides. Strange roads and longer roads and the ones that bring you somewhere you did not plan to be and cannot bring yourself to leave, be with you.